Good Yantiv, Shana Tova. This year I wrote 2 drashes, one on fear and one on love. I figured we'd take a vote. Raise your hand if you want the drash on fear. Raise your hand if you want the drash on love. Notice, who your partners are, and maybe link up with somebody afterwards that you should talk to. It turns out they're actually the same drash. Because in our tradition, fear and love are not opposites. They are 2 sides of the same heart. Next year's coin. And both are sacred teachers. When I was 19 years old, I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and decided to go on my first solo backpacking trip. It wasn't a very well-planned decision. I was 19. It was an impulse, a need to be in the wilderness. Not just a cute hiking trail on the edge of town, but deep into the wild. What could go wrong? It's one thing to imagine yourself in the wilderness, under the stars, surrounded by trees. It's another thing entirely to be out there, truly alone, but not really alone. You become a living, breathing creature among many other living creatures. Some benign, and others not so much. That night, I lay awake, gripped by primal fear. And so I did what any nice Jewish boy would do. I prayed, fiercely. It's amazing how fear can summon up the deepest and most authentic prayers of the heart. Suffice it to say that I made it to the morning, and what a morning it was. Not because of the sunrise or the beauty of the mountains, but because I had lived, and lived through my fear. Years later, when I would read the story of Jacob leaving his home and spending the night alone in the wilderness, it became clear that we shared a similar experience. The word that shows up consistently throughout that story is the word yira, fear. Yes, it can be translated as awe, but let's not soften it. Fear is a raw and essential experience. And Jacob was in it, and so was I. That night, alone in the wilderness, I had to confront a fear that was ancient, elemental. A fear that in time I would come to respect. Like anyone who spends the night alone in the wild discovers, it taught me something fundamental about what it means to be human. Finite, vulnerable, and even compassionate. Like the Inuit have many words for snow, in Hebrew we have many words for fear. Each captures a subtle difference. Pachad, the fear of immediate danger. Yira, the fear that inspires awe. Ema, an existential fear. But words fail to capture the gut-wrenching fear that many of us have felt over the past year. Even from across the world, we sense the tremors of the violent acts that haunt us. Our collective Jewish nervous systems, a symphony of sympathetic resonance, tuned by centuries of inherited trauma. Amen. That's all we need to hear. So what do we do with this fear? We may turn to the famous words of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. The whole world is a narrow bridge, and the main thing is not to fear. But interestingly enough, that's not what Rabbi Nachman taught. The first part is correct. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od. The whole world is a narrow bridge. But the second part does not say, v'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. In his teachings, he says, lo lahitpached klal. Rabbi Nachman doesn't say not to fear, because we know that is not possible. He says, lo lahitpached klal. We must not let fear consume us. Fear can serve us well. It has helped us to survive. But it can also imprison us. And when fear overtakes us, we risk losing our connection to others, to life, and to God. Fear might promise safety, but unchecked, it can be our undoing. Jacob's fear became a path to learning and growth. How awe-inspiring is this place? Manorah makom hazeh. God was here, and I did not know it. But Abraham's fear almost led to the sacrifice of his son. An angel intervened, or his angelic voice intervened, saying, "You have made it known that you fear your God. You do not need to harm your son." All of us have to reckon with our fear, but how do we do it? Like in the famous children's story, going on a bear hunt. You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You have to go. So how do we move through our fear? As it turns out, some of our greatest teachers have lived through immensely difficult circumstances and have come through to the other side with important wisdom. In this past year, the two that I have learned the most from are the Piazetzner Rebbe, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, otherwise known as the Rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen Buddhist master whose teachings carried his people through the Vietnam War. Both lived through unspeakable atrocities, and yet both found ways to remain spiritually grounded and beacons of light to their students. Thich Nhat Hanh taught that mindfulness, spiritual awareness, is possible even in the midst of a war. Your awareness of the present moment, he said, is always possible even when the world is falling apart. He taught there are two dimensions to reality. The historical dimension, where events unfold, where human drama takes place, where suffering occurs. And there's also the ultimate dimension, a deeper realm where all things are interconnected, impermanent, and touched by divine reality. This teaching is profoundly Rosh Hashanah-dic. Our teshuvah, our return happens within the historical dimension as we reflect on our lives, our actions, and the fate of our world. But that's not the whole story. There's also the ultimate dimension. Melech al kisei ram v'nisa. The recognition of a higher reality that transcends the moment. As Rabbi Lawrence Kushner writes, the goal of all spiritual life is to get out of the way. Silence the incessant planning, organizing, running, manipulating, possessing, and processing that are ineluctable redoubts of the ego. Not because these activities are bad or wrong, but because they preclude awareness of the divine. He continues by saying, to paraphrase the Talmud, God says, there ain't room enough in this world for your ego and me. You pick. On Rosh Hashanah, this is our task, to get out of our own way, to realize, to realign with divine presence. At the climax of these 10 days, we cry out, Adonai hu ha'Elohim. The eternal is God. There is a divine reality, an ultimate dimension that I am realigning with. Yes, we live in a historical dimension and we stay connected to the ultimate dimension. This is teshuvah. What does the Piazetzner Rebbe have to say to us? His teachings, as many of you know, were written down during the years of the living hell of the Warsaw Ghetto. He buried them in a milk tin under the ground, and they were miraculously discovered after the war. The Piazetzner Rebbe maintained a yeshiva, a house of study during the years of the Warsaw Ghetto, providing for his students a spark of spiritual fire during times of great darkness. As one reads his weekly sermons, it becomes impossible to separate the teachings from the reality in which they were given. Had it not been for his explicit desire that his teachings be published, I would feel it to be a violation. Sitting in the comfort of my living room, reading the spiritual struggles of someone living through unspeakable horrors. Perhaps that was also the point. Amidst all his discourses on faith and suffering, he would tell his students that the most important thing you could do is to help another person. For him, the way to get to the other side of fear was through compassionate service. He would remind them that there were so many ways to do good in such desperate times, and to never look down upon those who were suffering. The Piazetzner lived his truth. When given the chance to escape the concentration camp, he chose to stay in order to continue to help his students in their time of greatest suffering. As I studied and continue to study the teachings of these luminaries, it became clear that they shared many things in common. For both the Piazetzner Rebbe and Thich Nhat Hanh, gratitude was essential, even in the midst of desperate circumstances, something we might take for granted in our relatively privileged lives. The Rebbe taught his students that if they couldn't find blessings in their immediate reality, they might recall the smell of a Shabbat meal or the sight of a loved one. And these reminders of goodness were enough to open up the heart. Thich Nhat Hanh instructed his students in deep gratitude and mindfulness for the simple acts of life, the simple aspects of life. Because you are alive, he said, everything is possible. Drink a cup of tea and stop the war, was a famous quote from one of his students. During these Yamim Noraim, these days of awe, we declare Uteshuva, Utefila, Utsedaka, Ma'avirin et Roa Hagazera. Teshuva, staying connected to the ultimate dimension while we repair what we can in the historical dimension. Tefillah, never forgetting how blessed we are. And tzedakah, compassionate service that we can give. These are what sweeten the harshness of the decree. But ma'avirin doesn't just mean sweetness, sweeten, to sweeten. It also means to pass through ma'avir. In other words, these three practices, teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, are how we move through fear, how we pass through fear. Through the teachings of the Piazetzner and Thich Nhat Hanh, it is clear that though we cannot bypass our fear, we can move through it and transform it into something sacred. May we all find the courage to walk through our fears into a place of deeper love, compassion, and connection. Shana Tova.